Hi, have you ever wondered how to synthesizer? Well, have I got the video for you. So I just got this modular in the studio briefly. I'm borrowing it, and I thought while I have it here, this would be a really good opportunity to make a video about how to use a synthesizer. The objective of this video is to make it fun, easy to follow, and not boring. So let me know in the comments down below if I accomplished any or all of those three things. Now I know this isn't going to be anywhere close to what any of you guys have, or at least most of you guys. Most of you guys are going to be watching this messing around with Serum, or like a mini log or something basic and inexpensive like that. But I thought this would be a good way to show you how a synthesizer works because everything is modular and you can see where everything is going. Now the big difference between something like this and your Serum, or Omnisphere, or Massive, or whatever you're using, is that none of the connections on something like this are normaled. You have to patch everything in, and it doesn't have any kind of keyboard or anything. So the only control you can do is either over MIDI or via something like a sequencer. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're gonna go over the basics, and then we're gonna explain all of the more intricate parts of a synthesizer. And I'm gonna be going over a monophonic synth. That's a synth with one voice, and I'll explain that later. But we're just keeping it simple for this video. This is just basics. So I might make another video with more advanced options, like a polyphonic synthesizer, going over things like unison and effects and stuff like that. But for this video, we're just gonna be going over the basics. So I'm gonna kind of jump around between two modules right now because I need both of them to make a sound. So firstly, I'm gonna explain the purpose of this module right here, which is called the amplifier, or the VCA. VC stands for voltage controlled because this is an analog synthesizer. And you'll hear me throw out terms like VCF and VCO, and that just stands for voltage controlled oscillator or filter. Anyway, the amplifier is usually the last stage of the synthesizer before going out to your audio interface or your speakers or your headphones. And basically, its only job is to amplify the signal. And therefore you have very basic controls like gain. Sometimes if you have a fancy VCA, you will have a linear or exponential switch for the gain control. You will have a control level, so that's for coming from something like an envelope or an LFO, which we'll talk about in a second. You have control inputs that come from that LFO or envelope or whatever you're using to control the VCA. You have signal inputs for what you want to amplify or output to whatever you're outputting to. And then you have your two outputs, one of which is a positive polarity and the other is negative polarity. So that is your amplifier. It's literally just for making things make sound. And then we go back to the left. This is an oscillator. This is what's going to make your sound about 95% of the time. I'll go into that other 5% in just a little bit here. So for your oscillator, you have some pretty basic controls. You have the octave selector. You have a coarse tune. Sometimes you will also get a fine tune. You'll get a hard sync patch point or switch or whatever if you're using a software synthesizer or a keyboard synthesizer. You will get a frequency control point, going to go from something like an LFO or an envelope or something. Again, we'll talk about those in a minute. For your square wave, you will have a pulse width control and a patch point to control that with an LFO or an envelope or something. You have another frequency control. This one's exponential as opposed to linear up here. And that's very handy for going from something like a sequencer or an LFO or something where you have 1 volt per octave because sound and frequency are exponential, not linear. And then you have outputs for all of your different wave shapes. This one has a sine wave, which is not super common on analog synthesizers. We have a triangle wave, a saw wave, a ramp wave, and a square or pulse wave, whichever you want to call it. So if we want to experience these waveforms and see what they sound like, let's plug it in. So let's get one patch cord here. Let's go from the output of the sine wave into one of our signal inputs on the VCA here. And we get a sine wave. Look at that. So, that's a sine wave. Sine waves are the most round and have the least harmonic content out of any of the waveforms on a synthesizer. And that's because the peaks are round. So let's throw up a handy dandy oscilloscope here somewhere and check out what the wave actually looks like. Surprise, it looks like a sine wave. Now let's try a triangle wave. Now you notice this one is a little brighter sounding than a sine wave because it has more harmonic content, and that's because the peaks are a little spikier. Now let's try a saw wave. That one's pretty loud. And why is it so loud? Because it has a lot of harmonic content. In fact, it has the most harmonic content out of any of these raw wave shapes. And that's because the peaks are the spikiest. They're the sharpest. We go to a ramp wave, which some synthesizers have, some don't. It's a little more rare. It sounds the same because it's basically just a saw wave with the polarity inverted. And this is a pulse or square wave. And what's cool about pulse waves is you can change their width, so watch this. Isn't that cool? So enough of that. Let's look at the other controls on this and see what they do. So we're gonna go back to a sine wave because it's the least jarring of all of these waves to listen to. So right now we are at the 8-foot wavelength. If we flick it up one, we are at the 4-foot wavelength. Now we're at the 2-foot wavelength, so we're getting higher in pitch by an octave every time. Now we're at the 16-foot, so we're an octave below original. Now we're at 32 foot, so we're 2 octaves below original. And the low option is kind of rare on synths nowadays, but you'll see it in a lot of Moog synths, especially on the 3rd oscillator, where you get the ability to use it as an LFO. A term I've not used yet, but I will explain later. So let's go back up to 16-foot wavelength, because that's kind of our normal wavelength, and we can check out the coarse frequency control. So that's how you would adjust it to different semitones or half steps, or if you wanted to get really fine with it and adjust it by cents, which are hundredths of a semitone or half step. Now these other controls here don't really do anything unless we connect them to other stuff, so let's not mess with that for now. We'll come back to it. I mentioned LFOs earlier, so we're gonna mess with one right now. We have another oscillator up here that you can't really see that well, but that's okay because all we're gonna do is set it to low. We're going to take the triangle wave output, which you can see, and we're going to send it to the exponential frequency input of this oscillator here. Take another patch cable now and take the pulse wave out so you can hear it very clearly. I'm going to turn the gain down a little bit here. Plug it into the signal inputs. What's going on here? Aha! We are modulating the pitch of this oscillator with another oscillator. Doesn't that sound cool? So basically what I've done here is I've taken another oscillator and modulated the pitch of our original oscillator with it. And that is where something called an LFO comes in. And that stands for low frequency oscillator. And that's why you have this low option here, because that way you can use this oscillator as an LFO. LFOs are almost always used to modulate other things, whether that's the pitch or the frequency of the filter or anything else. So here I've done something very basic, and I've just modulated the pitch of our original oscillator with it. And that's what it sounds like. We can adjust the frequency of the oscillation. Or the amount. Or we can take another wave out of the LFO. So instead of a triangle, let's take a pulse wave. That sounds like R2D2. So that's pretty cool. And all of that is with just 2 oscillators and a VCA, which is really, really simple. So now let's try something different. We're going to take the pulse width input here. We have our pulse wave going out to the VCA. And we're going to take a triangle wave from the LFO going into the pulse width of our oscillator here. And remember that changing the pulse width sounds like that. So now let's modulate it with this oscillator. So now we get a cool chorusy effect that happens when you modulate the pulse width. So that's pretty cool. Let's move on to our next section. So we're going to take our output here and disconnect it. We're going to take the saw output this time just to spice things up, and we'll throw it into a mixer here. So input 1 level here. I'm just doing that because I know this filter has level inputs, but most filters on synthesizers will not have a level attached to them or a gain control. You will have to use a mixer separately to control the gain going into the filter. So that's what I'm doing here, just for a consistency standpoint for whatever you're using. So then you take an output from your mixer, a signal input on your filter. We're going to start with this filter here, which is a state variable filter, meaning we get different filter types, and we'll go into those in a second. And the first type we're going to try out is the low-pass filter, which is probably the most common type of filter you're going to hear on a synthesizer. We'll take that and we'll go into one of our signal inputs on the VCA. So now we'll turn up our input 1 level here. We already have going into here full volume, and we're going to turn up our gain on our VCA. You'll notice we're not really hearing anything. The reason why is because the frequency or the cutoff on our filter is all the way down, and since it's a low-pass filter, it's cutting off all the high-frequency content above the cutoff amount, which is all the way at 0. So let's turn that up, and you'll see we start getting more high-frequency content. When we turn it down, we get less of that. Now we also have a control here called resonance, and that is also called the Q factor or quality factor, and that is a peak right above the cutoff frequency of the filter. So you'll notice when we turn that up and we sweep the filter here, it almost creates a tone right above that cutoff point, and that's because it's accentuating that frequency a lot. Now here's a fun thing. Remember how I said 95% of the time the sound is going to come from the oscillator? Well, that's because we're learning something called subtractive synthesis. And that's where you have a sound that you begin with, and all you're doing before the output stage is you're taking away from it, whether that be by putting a filter on it and subtracting frequencies, or putting envelopes on it and subtracting a time factor, or whatever else you're doing. Whereas on an additive synthesizer, you are taking a basic waveform and then folding it a whole bunch of times to create new harmonic content. I'm not going to go over that in this video because that's a lot more complicated than real basic subtractive synthesis like this. But that 5% of the time where the oscillator is not making the noise, it's usually the filter. So let me explain. I'm going to turn the mixer all the way down for the input level on our oscillator here, so none of the sound from the oscillator is going into the filter right now. This is basically like there's nothing before this filter. In fact, I can even unplug the filter from the oscillator completely. But listen what happens when we crank the resonance and we sweep the filter frequency. There's a very faint tone that you can hear when we sweep that frequency. And the reason why is because the filter creates a little tiny, almost imperceivable bit of its own noise. And when you crank the resonance like that, it creates a tone right at that cutoff frequency. And that's without anything plugged into it. So it's all that tiny little bit of noise creating that tone. And that's how a lot of synthesizer players like to get sine waves, because that is the closest to a sine wave you can get on an analog synthesizer, is by using a frequency resonance like that. So let's plug in our oscillator again. We'll turn up the input level and turn down the resonance. Now we're going to explore some other types of filters. So we've already looked at the low pass filter. Now we're going to try the opposite, which is a high pass filter. So you'll notice we already have sound, which is completely different than the low pass filter. But as we turn up the frequency, we lose low frequency content because it is cutting out the low frequencies. As we turn it back down, we get more low frequencies again. And this is used a lot in electronic music right before like a drop or something to increase like the energy of the drop, because it kills all the low end, creating some tension. So when you hear that in electronic music, it's a high pass filter. Let's try a different one. There's also a band pass filter. And basically, it's a low pass and a high pass filter at the same time. So all you're getting is that middle frequency right on the cutoff point. And if you turn up the resonance, you might recognize this effect. It's a wah pedal. A wah pedal is basically just a fancy bandpass filter. Now we have the exact opposite of a bandpass filter, which is a notch filter. So where a bandpass filter only lets the stuff at the cutoff point through, this lets everything but the stuff at the cutoff point through. It's pretty cool. So now we've switched over to this filter. It's a transistor ladder filter. That's just referring to how it's designed. You'll see them a lot in Moog synthesizers. And this one I wanted to show because it has a unique feature which some synthesizers will have, and a lot of software synthesizers will have this, which is a switchable slope. And the slope is referring to the slope of the filter at the cutoff point. So the cutoff is not going to immediately kill all the frequencies above that point. It's going to gradually slope them off. And usually this is measured in one of two ways, which is either in decibels per octave, so that's how many decibels it is cutting per octave of the frequency spectrum, or in poles. And poles is really just an easier way of saying so-and-so decibels per octave. So each pole is 6 decibels per octave of gain reduction. So if you have a 2-pole filter, it's a 12 decibel per octave filter. If you have a 4-pole filter, it's 24 decibels per octave. So we have it on the 2-pole or 12 decibel slope right now. So as I sweep this, you'll notice it retains quite a bit of the high frequencies, which is why we would call it a bright filter. Whereas if we switch it to 24 decibels per octave, you'll notice a difference here. It's retaining a lot less of those high frequencies, which is why we would call this a dark filter. So the more poles, or the more decibels it is reducing the gain of the output of the filter, the darker the filter would be. The fewer poles, or the less gain reduction of each octave of the frequency spectrum of the filter, the brighter the filter is going to be. So we've gone over oscillators, we've gone over amplifiers, and we've gone over filters. So let's go over the last thing in a basic synthesizer, which is the envelope generators. And we'll use 2 of them here because most synthesizers will have 2 of them. So an envelope generator is going to affect how it sounds over time. And that starts when you press a key or trigger the gate in this specific instance. It's the same thing if you have a keyboard synthesizer, until you release the key. So 2 common places that these envelope generators end up being routed to are the filter and the amplifier, which changes the brightness of the sound and the loudness of the sound. So let's take the output of one of our envelope generators here, and let's patch this into the frequency of our filter here. So I'm going to turn up our frequency about halfway here, so we have a little bit of sound coming through, but we can still tell what the envelope is doing. We're going to adjust everything down here, and we're going to see what it does when we press the gate button, which is the same as pressing a key on a keyboard synthesizer. We get a really short blip, and I'll tell you why. We have 4 controls here: attack, decay, sustain, and release, and they are all set to 0. So the attack is going to be how much time after you press the key it takes to reach the maximum gain. The decay is how long it will take to go from the maximum gain to the sustained gain. The sustain is the amount of sustained gain. And the release is how much time after you release the key it takes to reach 0 again. So, say if we increase the decay and only the decay, we get somewhat of a plucky sound. If we increase just the sustain, we just get a sustained note for as long as we hold the gate or the key. If we increase the attack, we get a softer note that takes longer to reach the maximum level. So we can combine these to create whatever kind of sound we want. So say we want something that's kind of a soft note, we can increase the decay and release to around the same time, so it doesn't matter if we keep holding or release the key. And we can have the attack go up a little bit. And now we have kind of a nice little soft sound, and we can adjust how much that affects the filter too with this level amount. So that's just a little bit. It's a little more. You get the idea. And if we want this sound to sustain over the period that we press the note, we can do that too by turning the sustain up. Or we can set it to a middle level, which means that it will still sustain but not as high. And that's what that does. So let's turn our frequency back down. Let's turn our level up so we can still hear the effect that it has. Maybe we'll turn the attack down so it's a little more immediate. There we go, we got a nice little pluck there. And then we can also see the effect that this has on the VCA, which affects the loudness of the signal. So let's take our second envelope generator here. We'll take the output and patch it into control input 1 and set the control input level all the way up. So if we set our gain down here, then this will add to our gain here. So say we want a plucky sound, we can set our frequency all the way up and set all of these down, set our decay kind of a little bit, maybe at 3. And then when we press our gate, notice how that's different from that affecting the filter because it stays bright over that period. It's just that instead of affecting the filter, it affects the volume. So you might be asking, if LFOs and envelopes are our modulation sources, and we have all these destinations, can we just assign random things to random places? And the answer is yes. Yes, you can. So instead of taking this envelope, maybe let's take this oscillator and assign the saw wave to the filter cutoff. And that's what that sounds like. It just does that. Or let's say, put it on the amplifier. So turn the gain down, turn the control level up, and set the control input to this. So yes, you can assign anything to anything if you want. And then lastly, I wanted to go into explaining a monophonic, which is what we have here, synthesizer with one voice, versus a polyphonic synthesizer, which I will not get into here. I'll just say it has more than one voice. And you might be thinking, what's the difference between a voice and an oscillator? And I see people getting hung up on this all the time because it kind of gets confusing. But I hope this clears it up for you. I actually have a graphic that I drew up briefly on my iPad. But think of a voice like multiple keys that you can press at the same time, where each key gets its own filter and envelopes and amplifier and oscillators. So basically, each key is like its own synthesizer that you can play. And most of the time, synthesizers will be sort of limited in this way, where the controls will be the same for every key, but you can play each key as if it was its own synthesizer. So say you press one key and that has its own decay, and you press another and that has its own decay. And that's because each key will have its own envelope generator. Whereas if you have something like a monophonic synthesizer where you only have one voice, then you can not only press one key at once, but even if you were able to make it paraphonic, where you have multiple oscillators that all share one filter, one amplifier, one of everything, then each key won't have its own envelope generator where it shares the same decay as another one. And the number of voices, say I have a Korg Prolog 16, so it has 16 voices, will limit how many keys you can press at the same time. So on that one, you can press up to 16 keys at the same time, and they will all have their own individual synth voice. And the difference between this and an oscillator is an oscillator is tied to the voice that it is within. So you can have multiple oscillators per voice, it's just that they will all share one filter, one amplifier, one envelope, etc. So you can make it sound like you have more than one voice by detuning each oscillator to a chord or something, but it will still be one voice because they all share the rest of the chain. TLDR, the more voices you have, the more keys you can press at the same time. And if you only have one voice, you can only press one key at once, and it will just make that one pitch and have that one envelope. So that's it for this video. I hope it was helpful for you. I think I'm going to do a part 2 with a more traditional synthesizer, maybe a software or a hardware keyboard synth, probably something you're more used to. And that will also go into more advanced techniques, like some that I mentioned briefly in this video, like sync or polyphony or unison or any of those things. But hopefully this video gives you a grasp on what you're looking at when you're looking at something like Serum or Massive or even a hardware synth like Juno or something. So thank you for watching. If this was helpful to you or if you think I missed anything, leave your comments down below and let me know. And until the next video, stay safe, and I'll see you. Peace.